This last weekend, Marc went head over heels in Germany. Pecco Bagnaia was back to business as usual, and Trackhouse Racing gave the Americans a 4th of July weekend to celebrate. But before I get into everything that happened all weekend long at the German Grand Prix, if you could please subscribe, help us grow here on YouTube. And a fun little fact, I usually respond to basically every single comment. So come on, let's talk MotoGP. Now, at the start of the race weekend on Media Day, Marc Marquez said he had to have a perfect weekend to even hope to battle with Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin. Did he get that perfect weekend? No, he did not. Well, at least not right away, because a big high-side crash left him with a broken finger and bruised ribs and a lap time that wasn't good enough to get straight into Q2. And on Saturday, he was still feeling the pain because he did not get himself out of Q1 and had to start 13th for the sprint and the main Grand Prix. There were some other big crashers in practice and qualifying. We had Maverick Vinales having a very nasty high side of his own, and Fabio Di Giannantonio going off the track and immediately getting up and clutching his shoulder. I thought for sure broken collarbone, he'd be out for the weekend, but Fabio Di Giannantonio goes to the medical center, gets a checkup, gets the thumbs up, goes back on the track, and puts in a lap time that gets him into Q2. And not wanting to be outdone by his teammate Marco Bezzecchi, who was in that Q1 session, puts in a fast enough lap to move himself into Q2 with his teammate Fabio Di Giannantonio. And maybe the surprise of the weekend was Raul Fernandez also making it from Q1 into Q2 and then putting himself on the front row. But would it be too much to ask to have two Trackhouse Aprilias on that front row for our 4th of July weekend? No, that wasn't too much to ask, says Miguel Oliveira. He puts in a blistering lap time during qualifying, missing pole position by 48 hundredths of a second. But no one had an answer for that one lap speed of Jorge Martin. He was yet again untouchable. Pecco Bagnaia, who had dominated from the beginning of Assen to the end, had a little bit more of a Pecco typical weekend. He was a little slower on Friday. He got up to speed, got himself into Q2, and then in qualifying finds himself in P4. But during the sprint race, he was not going to stay in P4. He storms directly to the front, tries to get position on Jorge Martin so he can lead the race throughout the entire proceeding. But if you know anything about sprint races in Jorge Martin, you know he doesn't stay in second place for very long. He makes a move on Bagnaia, gets back to the front, and no one showed him a wheel for the rest of the entire race. Wins it, going away, as they say. Pecco Bagnaia would have loved to settle for second place in the sprint, but Miguel Oliveira said, no, it's America's holiday. I'm going to the second step of the podium. Big sprint podium for Miguel Oliveira, and Trackhouse Racing Bagnaia has to settle for third, which means he loses 5 more points to Jorge Martin, putting him 15 points back in the championship. Now, elsewhere on Sprint Saturday, we had Enea Bastianini finishing 4th, Franco Morbidelli showing some speed finishing 5th, and Marc Marquez coming from 13th to 6th. Would that be a little bit of a foreshadowing for what was going to happen Sunday? Yes, it would be. But before we get to that, we have to talk about the start, and once again, Pecco Bagnaia trying to impose his will on Jorge Martin very early by getting to the front. But the early race pace of those Pramac Ducatis, both Jorge Martin and Franco Morbidelli, were just a little too much for Bagnaia to go with, and he felt that they were using too much tire, so he decided to pull back, save it for the end of the race. But would that strategy pay off? Meanwhile, Miguel Oliveira didn't have the same luck on Sunday that he had on Saturday. He started to fade a little bit, and Alex Marquez showed pace out of nowhere. If you would have asked him Saturday if he'd be running in the top 3, I don't think he would have said yes, but there he was. But it was his brother Marc Marquez who was on the move yet again, coming from 13th on the grid, making overtake after overtake and getting into a little bit of a skirmish with Franco Morbidelli. The two of them come together in turn 1. Marc loses some windshield, and then he thought, okay, if this is the time to push, I'm going to push right now. Screw this battling for 4th nonsense. And push he did. He dispatches Franco Morbidelli, catches up to his brother, moves into 3rd place, and knocks his brother off the podium. Kind of a bummer, right? But at the front with 3 laps to go, Pecco Bagnaia was closing the distance to Jorge Martin, putting pressure on the Spaniard, letting him know, I'm still here, and I've got some rear tire left. You know that conservation mode from earlier? Yeah, now we're in race mode. It looked like it was gearing up to be a last lap battle, with Bagnaia gaining a 1/10 of a second in basically every single sector, closing down that gap. Were we on for a classic here? Yes, we were, but it was not to be. Because much like a wide receiver crossing the middle on a football field and hearing the footsteps of the middle linebacker, Jorge Martin heard the footsteps of Pecco Bagnaia. He goes into turn 1 a little too hot, brakes a little too hard, and ends up with a little too much gravel in his boots. devastating crash for Jorge hands the win to Pecco Bagnaia, which promotes Marc Marquez into second place and Alex Marquez into third, making the two Marquez brothers the first brothers to share a Grand Prix podium in the Premier class since 1997. And you bet your ass that these brothers partied like it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because it may well be. Having both of them be fast and competitive in the same exact Grand Prix weekend is going to be very, very rare. Elsewhere in the race, Enea Bastianini finishes in a very lonely 4th place. Franco Morbidelli finishes 5th. Miguel Oliveira is the top Aprilia in 6th. Pedro Acosta the top KTM in 7th. But it was a very, very fun German Grand Prix from top to bottom. The Moto2 race was exciting, the MotoGP race was exciting, and unfortunately now it is summer break, and we're going to have to wait a little bit till the next one.